Okay, so so this is Harold, and I just thought I would record the writing lecture that I gave today so that I can get through the whole thing and also maybe reinforce a couple of the points. So again, this is Approaches to Good Writing, and off we go. As I mentioned, writing quality is one of your most important and most controllable variables. And whatever kind of writing you're doing, whether it's an academic paper, a grant proposal, letter of intent, student recommendation, an op-ed, there's a craft to it that needs to be respected. One of the things that I liked about today's discussion was people talked about the strengths and weaknesses of their writing games in a very open way. And one of the things we should talk about maybe in a later session is how we might raise our games, given some of the issues that people talked about. So here's the roadmap. Of course, you've heard a lot of this already. I've been working on my own writing skills, trying to raise my game and share my game as well in writing, emphasizing the importance of the show, don't tell aspect in every kind of writing. You use tactile detail rather than telling readers what to think. The simple is smart paradigm. Some of the ways that we can write clearly and with a sense of humility. We can even add a space where there's a space that belongs there. And being self-aware about some of our own writing tics, and then writing for different objectives. This bottom part I really didn't get to in the way that I wanted to. Okay. So as I mentioned, avoiding unforced errors and sloppiness is really important. You know, I had a really good paper that was rejected because of poor writing quality. And I just didn't carefully proofread it, and I had some really bad typos in an appendix that came out of a keyboard problem I had with an old computer. And as I mentioned, the reviewer was a real jerk about it, but the fact that there were these obvious glitches signaled a lack of care and craftsmanship, and it was really an unforced error on my part. Having someone proofread your work, that certainly was something that could have helped me there. And as I mentioned, you want to read that thing one last time after you can't bear to read it anymore. And that often pays off. And I just didn't do it with that manuscript, and it really hurt me. It was an important paper actually for a grant I was on, and it was really, really unfortunate that I didn't bring my A game to that. Some other obvious things. One is don't sledgehammer your readers. So here, this is, as I mentioned, this is an actual paragraph in a grant. No one's going to read that paragraph. It's just, you know, it's just a block of granite. There's lots of ways you can do surgery on grants to make sure you fit the page limit and so on. This is not a good way to do it. So you want to. No one has to read what you write. And in fact, even when they have to read it, if it's something like this, they may not. You know, I've been in NIH study sections where grants are poorly written, and you can just tell people hadn't read it. And you know, you really have to make things clear, inviting, and having that look of craftsmanship in the writing. So now I want to get to Derek Thompson's thing, why simple is smart. And the idea that complicated language sends a signal that a writer is dense or overcompensating. So some examples, some examples I'll give: my own college physics books, a recent social science piece, mansplaining my dissertation to my mom. I should say my mom is 92. She read my dissertation last year for the first time. She actually called me up. She asked me really good questions. It was actually impressive. And also how we might talk to generalist policymakers and agency leaders. One thing I talk about is a dietary intervention, and there's some other things that are in there too. So the idea with this dietary intervention is that somebody notices, hey, if you live near a clinic that offers a particular kind of diet program, you're more likely to take it. And that creates a kind of natural experiment that might allow you to understand the effectiveness of that diet program by sort of looking what's happening to people who live near that clinic compared to people who live a little bit less near that clinic and therefore are less likely to take on that diet program. for reasons that have nothing to do with them or the program, just where they live. And so, as we mentioned, here's 3 bullet points that I would certainly be very tempted to write in an email to one of our study staff. We use geographic proximity to control for endogenous selection into the dietary intervention. We used a diff and diff design to examine the causal impact of the dietary intervention. Here, this is from another intervention. We used a random forest algorithm with 5-fold cross-validation to predict ED use, and the ED being emergency department. And the idea, each of these things, very good shorthand if you're talking in a community of people where that's the jargon, very bad way to talk to generalist policymakers or agency leaders who have really terrific insights, but just this is not the language that they speak. So we'll come back to this. Here's just classic examples of bad writing. We talked about this very well in class. Here we just see this is a super long rambling thing with lots of, also includes things like quotation marks for no apparent reason. Kind of has to go to the NSA for decryption. And this is a person who's trying to convey a kind of sophistication through complicated writing that really just makes you want to stop reading it. This is a famous thing. Judith Butler is a very famous philosopher and English scholar. This very esoteric writing that this may actually be somewhat better because it's really intended for a very narrow audience of people. I mean, I personally hate this kind of writing. When you sort of see homologous ways to a view of hegemony and etc. But there's a community of people who write that way, and this may not be quite as bad as it looks. But certainly, if you were writing for a large audience of people, you would never want to write either one of these passages. Smart is often hard, but is simply written. Sometimes you're talking about hard stuff. So here we have, this is from my from Electricity and Magnetism by E.M. Purcell, and as I mentioned, he's the person who invented what is now the MRI machine. It used to be called nuclear magnetic resonance. Here, hear the sentence: Poynting's theorem tells us that the work done on the charges by the electromagnetic force equals the decline in energy stored in the field minus the energy that flows out through the surface boundary. Or moving parallel to a current carrying conductor, the charged particle experiences a force perpendicular to its direction of motion. But what if the particle instead moves at right angles to the conductor? And this is, if you're not an electricity and magnetism person, you're like, hey, I don't know what Poynting's theorem is, but this is really clearly written, and it's clearly written stuff about a complicated subject. And one of the things that's really striking is how in math and physics, in the natural sciences, people write quite clearly, and bite-sized chunks with minimal jargon, and much simpler writing than we see in social science. And I do think there's a sociological reason for that. Everybody already knows it's hard. There's just no need to signal, wow, this is complicated, hard stuff. And if you write in physics in a way that people can't understand, that's actually a negative status symbol. It shows either you're trying hard to show off about something, or you just don't know enough about what you're talking about. And I mentioned in the lecture, there's this wonderful anecdote about Arthur Eddington, where he was asked by a journalist, is it true that only 5 people understand Einstein's theory of general relativity? And he looked up and he said, who's the 5th? And what's striking about that, there's actually a really nice general relativity textbook by Steven Weinberg where he says this anecdote was not true. That when Einstein wrote the general theory of relativity, all the people that were sort of in that field, they understood what he was doing. And if they didn't understand it, they would have thought, wow, Einstein's a real jerk, that he did this important theory and he didn't take the time to make it clearly explainable. And as I mentioned, the anecdote mansplaining my dissertation to my mom, one of the great self-owns that I didn't know was a self-own at the time, my mom just said, well, what are you doing in your dissertation? And I said, well, Mom, well, see, I'm afraid you kind of don't have the real training for me to really explain what I'm doing. And, it's like I didn't understand my dissertation well enough to explain it to my own mom, who, as I mentioned, at age 92, read the thing and understood it very well and asked me reasonable questions about it. There, my, I think I mentioned in the lecture, my college roommate was valedictorian of the university, and he was a mathematician. And I could ask him any question about any complicated thing. He became a well-known mathematician. He could give a very simple explanation for a lot of stuff. And if he couldn't give the explanation, he'd say, "Oh, you're right. I guess I don't understand that as well as I thought I did." And then he'd sort of think about it for a while and come back with a simple explanation. Um, this is an interesting social psychology set of findings on the compensatory conspicuous communication problem. The way that needless complexity and jargon are confusing, but they also ironically trigger the reader's perception that the writer is less astute or lower status. As I believe I said in the conversation, the one thing I don't like about this article is that it does not take into account positionality. Daniel Oppenheimer is a professor at Princeton. I'm a professor at the University of Chicago. We walk into a conversation with some positionality where people assume our expertise. And so we don't have to use, we don't have to communicate complex stuff in order to get standing in the conversation as experts. And one of the challenges that I want to make sure we're aware of is that a lot of other people have very impressive expertise, but just don't have the same kind of prestigious positionality for one reason or another. Or for whatever reason, they're worried that they won't be taken seriously by the audience. They do feel it's important to show their wares a little bit. So so I think this is a really useful thing for writing, but it's also something where a lot of this compensatory conspicuous communication isn't coming out of nothing. It's coming out of people's actual awareness. My audience is not going to take me seriously unless I show them some of my expertise. And so I'll just note that. But nonetheless, I think this is a really important thing for us to keep in mind. So another thing is just basic sentence structure. A lot of people mentioned concision is really important. You want to avoid sentence roadblocks and detours. You want to keep related words and ideas close together, subject and predicate, verb and object together. I just made this goofy, complicated sentence that I tweeted out where I sort of stuck in the middle, a bunch of clauses in the middle of a long, badly written sentence. Just to make the point that short, simple sentences are the way to go. The only time long sentences are sometimes good when you have a list of things. There are times when a long sentence can be useful, but most of the time, concision is really good. Again, I recommend there's this wonderful book, Good Prose by Tracy Kidder and Richard Todd. It's just a really, Tracy Kidder's a gifted writer who's won a lot of writing awards. And he wrote The Soul of a New Machine and some other books that, won awards. And I really like the way they frame this. They say to write is to talk to strangers. You want them to trust you. You might as well begin by trusting them, by imagining for the reader an intelligence at least equal to the intelligence that you imagined for yourself. No doubt you know some things the reader does not, but it helps to grant that the reader has knowledge unavailable to you. And this isn't generosity, but it's realism. Imagine that I'm giving a talk about de-escalation of people with serious mental illness who are encountering police, and I'm talking to an audience of police leaders. Like Rebecca and I teach in the Police Leadership Academy. There's going to be some stuff in my lecture, hopefully, that's new to them. Otherwise, I'm wasting their time. But the idea that I have any greater expertise in the general domain of policing and dealing with people, in complex situations after a 911 call and so on, obviously, I don't. This is their world, and they're really impressive, capable people. So I want to make sure that I write in a way that really respects my readers. Um, and when I'm trying to think about how to communicate jargon to them, or some sort of a research finding that's complex or whatever, I'm not dumbing it down. I'm just thinking, how do I communicate in this relationship to this person that is every bit the equal of myself, but just this is an area where they're less familiar than I am. And I think that's a really important thing to always keep in mind. So here we talked in the lecture quite a bit about sort of comparing these sentences. I don't think the stuff on the right here, I don't think is particularly great, but it is more clear in some ways than what's on the left. So here it says we use geographic proximity as an instrument for endogenous selection into the dietary intervention. Talking to a bunch of master's trained economists who've taken the Harris School econometric sequence. This is exactly the kind of language that is familiar to people. Similarly, with this, we use a diff and diff design to examine the causal impact of a dietary intervention. Or if you're talking to a bunch of people who are data scientists, we used a random forest machine learning algorithm with 5-fold cross-validation to predict emergency department use, and then examine the feature importance graph. You're talking to anybody else in American society, a lot of the stuff you're just you're obviously going to lose people because there's just a lot of jargon here that people don't know, and the fact that you're deploying jargon that obviously they don't know is disrespectful, and people will interpret it that way. So if we look at this first thing, so the idea is that there's people who happen to live near the dietary intervention, and they're more likely to take it up. So we can use that as a kind of natural experiment. So here's just a way that I try to say this in sort of plain English. We can't just compare outcomes among participants in our diet program to non-participants, because the most health conscious people may seek out the intervention. That's the endogenous selection issue. But we noticed that recruited patients who happened to live near one of our clinics were more likely to participate. And we use this fact to explore the impact of our dietary intervention. In statistical jargon, we used proximity as an instrument for endogenous selection into our intervention. So what we're doing in this last sentence, we're basically giving the reader, the audience, permission to not know the jargon that we're about to use. So in the jargon of my own particular profession, here's how I would say it. And I'm just saying that openly to the audience so they can understand what I'm saying. Or this diff and diff thing, we compare trends across intervention and controlled neighborhoods and how those trends changed when and where we implemented increased, I should say, police patrols. We explored whether intervention neighborhoods showed a flatter local time trend post-intervention than we saw in comparison neighborhoods. That's basically the common sense way to talk about a lot of these, what are called diff and diff designs. And there's one set of neighborhoods we did something, and there was a trend, and the trend changed. And there's another set of neighborhoods where you didn't do anything, and the trend kind of continued the way it was. That's pretty straightforward. I'm not sure that I described it just now or in this PowerPoint as well as it could be, but you could see it's pretty straightforward. It doesn't require a huge amount of jargon. And then the last thing, we used a machine learning algorithm called random forest to predict emergency department use, then examine the most important predictive variables that emerged from that analysis. So I'm avoiding the jargon. The feature of importance graph is identifying the most important predictive variables, but there's no particular reason to use jargon like that. Okay? If I had a graph that was the feature importance graph, I could say, I'm about to show you something that's called a feature importance graph. And it's really a way that we show the most important predictive variables. So here's the graph. You can introduce it to people if you need to. Okay? So now words, sentences, and paragraphs. So words convey tone, positionality, familiarity, and engagement with the audience. I'm using words that are part of our relationship. Sentences clearly communicate one idea at a time. And there's some ways that words, phrases, I should say, and sentences can fail you. One is by imprecision and fuzziness, or by wooden or flabby prose, just being a pompous windbag, which of course we professors are awesome at, or in failures of cultural competence and humility that comes up in all kinds of ways. Sometimes around race, ethnicity, gender, class, education, a lot of stuff around age. Sorry, that's my phone telling me it's 10:35. Absolutism and overstatement are just bludgeoning the reader in one way or another. There are ways that we sometimes glide over weaknesses in our arguments with euphemisms and dishonesty. You got to be self-aware about that. Uh, departing from the show don't tell paradigm, arguing by adjective. You never convince anybody by saying, this is just a shocking thing. What you convince somebody with is you say, here's something that's obviously shocking, and you state it in an understated way, and they will be shocked. That's the way you convince someone to be shocked. Uh, bombastic analogies. One thing that is really bad about social media is that people make stupid, bad arguments that are based on bombastic analogies, or just tone failures that tend to alienate people. So those are some of the things you got to watch out for. So let me just say a few more things about jargon. I think this is repetition. Jargon is great shorthand when you're speaking with the audience and you're using a familiar vernacular, or when you're respectfully explaining to an outsider who needs to know the terms what the term is. If I'm talking to health lab staff, I might say, we often neglect intersectionality when discussing policy challenges that concern people with disabilities. That's actually a really important aspect of disabilities that I've hammered on many, many times talking to people at health lab. When in the work that Rebecca does with the Transform 911 work, where you're in a community of people that are really marinating in that world, there's a lot of vernacular 911 jargon that people use because that's the way people talk. And if I'm watching a basketball game and all the fans are sort of really diehard basketball fans, I might say, man, the Bulls just are not defending that pick and roll. And you don't have to explain the pick and roll to those people if they're sort of super basketball fans. But of course, everything I've just said can be unintentionally excluding to a lot of other people. So, if you're speaking with people with disabilities and their loved ones, there's no reason to use the word intersectionality directly, or you can use it and explain it. And you can just say, we often neglect the ways that disability interacts and can magnify, I should say, interacts with and can magnify other barriers, such as poverty, minority status, or immigration. Let's fix that. Speaking of, you should proofread. And if I'm talking to someone who's not a basketball fan and I say, hey, look at the way this guy just scored a basket against the Bulls, where they did this play that's called a pick and roll. And look at the way that guy set that pick, and then he went to the basket, and the Bulls just did not defend that. And that was a very predictable play that Bulls just have to raise their game on. If you really are an expert at basketball, you should be able to explain that in a very straightforward way. Now, we do want to be self-aware if you're using jargon to signal your expertise, or if you're trying to do anything other than clearly communicate to the reader. Am I trying to hide something? Am I trying to bully or intimidate my reader? Am I trying to impress my reader? When those are all red flags. And even if you're giving like a job talk, sometimes you think, if I'm giving a job talk, I really want to impress people. Turns out, no. That's the most impressive job talk is when you have the stuff under the hood that's complex, but you're talking about it in a really simple, succinct, unpretentious way. People say, wow, that she really did a great job of using these methods really well in her paper, and then talking about it to this broad audience in a very accessible way. So let me say some things about op-eds. So I write a lot of op-eds, and some often with Health Lab people. So you can see here's one with Rebecca and Jason Lerner. Here's another one with Jason Lerner. But this one, when a teenager wants a semi-automatic rifle, that's enough of a red flag, obviously timely. That's written with one of my posts, with one of my medical research fellows. And op-ed writing is really good training for every other kind of writing that we do. Because of course, when you're writing an op-ed, it has to be well written, it has to engage the reader, and it's very good training. And I must say, I miss my editor passed away. My editor at the Washington Post edited several of these pieces, and he was having a good editor is so valuable. The one thing is thinking about your introduction. These are really these are really nice introductions for drawing the reader in. So you start reading, this is Atul Gawande, and he starts telling this story. I was chatting with a medical school friend of mine who's now a general surgeon in San Francisco. We were trading war stories, as surgeons are apt to do. One of John's was about a guy who came in on Halloween night with a stab wound. He had just been at a costume party. He got into an altercation, and now here he was. And you're like, hey, what happened? Or this one, Mao Zedong arrived in Moscow in 1949, expecting to be feted for delivering China, the world's most prosperous nation, to communism. Instead, Joseph Stalin humiliated him by making him late for a meeting. And you're like, well, that's kind of interesting. That's kind of intriguing. I wonder where Farrah Stockman's going with that. Sometimes you just want to be mundane and set the stage. So here's something, this is the beginning of an academic piece or grant writing. The value of de-escalation training to serve people living with serious mental illness is well established. The role of de-escalation training to serve people with intellectual disabilities is less well explored, but likely no less important. Required modifications of such training to address IDD are also understudied. Nothing sort of super glamorous and flashy about that, but you read those sentences and you're like, oh, I know what this is about. Now, one thing that's sort of interesting, I must say, this is something where in recent years, as our students have become more sensitive around various social issues, you have to be a little more careful with this approach to writing. But when you start off with a blunt, crisp issue statement, so here's one, Chicago police officers who identify as Republicans are far more likely than their peers to use excessive force in contacts with community residents. How should our city address this pattern? That's a really blunt thing. And you can imagine, imagine you're talking about other sensitive issues. You're talking about abortion, you're talking about affirmative action, a lot of things where you can imagine you hit people with a blunt sentence like that up front. You can imagine there's costs and benefits depending on how you want to relate to that audience. Sometimes that's a really good thing to do, just get people to sit up and say, oh, what's this guy going to get to? I must say, one of the things I like about University of Chicago is that we do have a culture where you get to it. And, and you can, in our classrooms, you can start with a sentence like this. I must say, of course, in our classrooms, it's a lot easier to start with a sentence like this that's bashing Republicans than if you bash Democrats, but that's just the sociology of who we are. But sometimes that's a really nice way to start. When you just say, here's the issue, and I'm just going to lay it out. And now I'm going to talk about it. Here's something that came out of another op-ed that I wrote with Jason, where we were writing about the COVID pandemic, and we say, from the start of the coronavirus pandemic, America has noted and honored the sacrifices made by first responders and medical professionals on the front lines. We've all seen searing nightly news footage of PPE-clad EMTs and so on. Another group of frontline professionals receives far less attention, yet is no less essential and has made no smaller sacrifice. So I'm not sure this is a full A+, but the idea is people are like, oh, what's that other group? You're drawing people in. And then the next paragraph says that other group is social workers who are often overlooked. I'll just note again the importance of particularity and tactile detail. Like, I love this expression, hurt people hurt people. By the way, sadly apt to this young man who committed the atrocity, who shot President Trump and killed other people. Turned out he was bullied in school, and he was a young man, a very disturbed young man. The thing about that hurt people is interesting and vivid, uses simple words to good effect. By the way, political professionals, of course, and advertisers are experts at this. Make America great again. Make America great again. If you think about that, that is a very well-crafted slogan. And there's a lot about that is hitting dopamine receptors. Make America great. And of course, this word again is triggering, a lot of interesting thoughts in the intended audience. Build back better. The silent majority. Medicare for all. Really interesting thing. Now, one thing, notice that there's lots of ways you can use flabby prose that are also things to be watched out, that you have to watch out for. So whenever you see the is and the sort of the verb to be, very often that's a flabby sentence. The goal of our project was to characterize the deterrent effect of random police stops in deterring DUI. There's no advantage of this sentence over, we explored whether random police stops deter DUI. And if so, by how much? I'm avoiding some pomposity, and I'm just getting to it. Now, sometimes you want to use the verb form of to be because you're describing a process. The group was deciding on a topic. That's basically saying there's a process going on. So sometimes you want to use that. By Strunk and White, this is what I'm taking here is straight out of, if you've seen The Elements of Style by Strunk and White, these are the kinds of things that they talk about quite a bit. Okay. Oops, let me see if I can advance the slide. Show, don't tell. As I said a billion times, tactile detail is more effective than evaluative adjectives. A really understated writing style is so much more persuasive, especially if you've got an actual detail. So here, personal experience of shocking violence are often precursors to violent offending. That's definitely a true statement. Arguments for school vouchers reflect hegemonic neoliberal ideology. Possibly a true statement. So when I see hegemonic and neoliberal, I sort of think word salad. My own personal sort of hackles tend to go up, but that's probably my own tick. You compare that with 47% of incarcerated Chicago gun offenders were previously wounded by gunfire. That's a statistic from one of our papers. That's basically getting into this personal experiences of shocking violence. But when I give that statistic, people are like, holy shit, 47%? When we talk to our study subjects, we'd be like, why are you carrying a gun? And they'd be like, why do you think? I was thinking about that when I watched Rebecca and the panel that she was at talking about gun violence in Chicago. Of course, a lot of the young men are carrying guns around. They're in situations where that's what makes them feel safe. Or guidance counselors and paid consultants at the most resourced middle schools helped parents navigate the confusing recommendation system, allowing privileged families preferential access to the school's most sought-after charter schools. That's kind of the way that neoliberal framework is operating in this school voucher sense. And one thing, avoid argument by air quotes or using quotation marks when you're not quoting anybody. So here's an example. Some people believe people with mental illness are dangerous. I'm like, what are you talking about? Some people believe people with mental illness are dangerous. It's actually pretty straightforward. There's no need. The quotation mark is basically an implicit disparagement of a position that you do not hold. And and it's not convincing anybody who is worried about people, somebody who actually believes that people with mental illness are dangerous, that quotation mark is just going to make them less receptive to whatever it is that you want to say. So the sort of whenever you're writing in a way where you can imagine there's an air quote, that's a big warning sign. Or whenever you're trying to convince someone by using an adjective rather than using a fact, that's a red flag. That's moving away from the show don't tell. Want to watch your personal writing tics and the ways that our own identities and insecurities and just personal stuff can come into our writing. Part of the issue that often comes up with a lot of us is throat clearing. So indeed and importantly, I myself am tempted to include the words indeed or importantly when these aren't really needed, or as such. Only MC Hammer can say as such. MC Harold can't use that term. There's a video of me dancing to Can't Touch This, which I will not show because it would be such a personal humiliation. As I mentioned, bad proofreading is a problem, and that's something I have to work on. I often send emails with stupid iPhone autocorrects. And also, of course, trying to signal sophistication or worthy values through complex sentence styles and evaluative adjectives rather than tactile details. And I'm sure each of us has other examples from our own writing that are our personal tics that we have to be careful about. Now, let me talk about some different kinds of writing that come up in particular contexts. Recommendation letters, grant and reviewer responses, letters of intent, grant applications. I actually won't say too much about policy memos, but there's some really nice materials on policy memos if folks want that. So recommendation letters. As I mentioned, the care that you take in your letter is itself a signal. I chaired our admissions committee, and one of the things that I did actually, which surprised people, was when someone wrote an excellent, high quality letter, I would write a thank you, and I would say, "Thank you, dear Professor X. Thank you for your high quality letter. There's nothing, this thank you, do not interpret this thank you as saying anything about the likelihood that your student will be admitted. This is a thank you to you that you took the time to give us a really high quality recommendation that helped us in our decision process." People are always shocked by when they get letters like that. They say, "I've never gotten a thank you like that." This year I read 7 recommendations in our job search that were actually, when we were looking at candidates that had applied for a position, that were addressed to the wrong school. As I mentioned, there was a guy who said, "University of Michigan is the perfect place for this junior scholar." This is, and we're reading this at the University of Chicago, which, of course, in like 7 different ways, communicates something that's completely inappropriate and does a disservice to the applicant. And I read many recommendation letters that are clear paraphrases of something that the candidate themselves wrote and passed to the recommender. In fact, I was on an NIMH study section that was a K award that I was reviewing, and I had 3 recommendations for this very outstanding young scholar, and the 3 letters they had a correlation of like 0.9. That scholar had provided his recommenders with sample language and so on, and they had all clearly just cut and pasted into their own letters, and that's and when you see that kind of minimal effort, that is a real problem, and it reflects badly on the applicant, and it's not the applicant's fault at all. So it's important to take time to do stuff. And the other issue that comes up is how we deal with grade inflation. Many of us have stopped answering the percentile questions. How would you rank this applicant? Are they in the top 5%, the top 28%, et cetera? So when I read graduate school applications, every student's in the top 5% in academic attainment. And then you look and you see 2.8 GPA. And you say, there's a lot that's impressive about the student, but they're not in the top 5% of academic attainment. And So many of us have started to leave those percentiles blank because there's no way to accurately communicate. It's very often what the person wants to say is, I know everybody else is going to click top 5%, and this is a really good applicant. And I want you to take that person seriously. So I'm going to click top 5% because if I said top 28%, you would interpret that as, wow, that's a really bad student. And so so I often leave those things blank, and I explicitly explain why. But then you give a tactile detail about why you're impressed by that student or that employee or that colleague, whatever it is, because the tactile details are the things that matter. And by the way, it's very good to talk to the person and to understand their self-described strengths and the way they present themselves, and then think about the aspects of their sales pitch and their self-described strengths that match what you value as a recommender. So that you can write honestly in a persuasive and clear way their strengths that relate to the way they're also describing themselves. So, I trust Phyllis to meet with a partner agency or community organization to manage randomization mechanics in REDCap and to produce a professional PowerPoint funder presentation. That's important in our lab because we as principal investigators must delegate many of these tasks to get the work done. So there's a tactile aspect to that that describes some very concrete thing that person does well, and you're being honest about what they're doing. And you say, this is why I admire that person. Now, by the way, you should, as I mentioned, be very self-aware about your implicit biases or things that you write that will trigger the implicit biases of your readers. And the anecdotes that we tell very, very often can inadvertently either reflect or reinforce various stereotypes that we have. So, as I mentioned, a lot of our women students and colleagues, they're described in very gendered terms. She's so empathetic, she's so kind, and she has a wonderful smile. And nobody, if I have a young male student that I'm writing a recommendation for who has all of those qualities, you don't see, oh, he's so empathetic, he's so kind, he's got a wonderful smile. And so we have to, it's very important to be self-aware of those things. As I mentioned, you got to actually do your own work. Don't just take somebody, if a student or gives you material to write a recommendation, don't just take what they did. You got to actually put in the time and do your own stuff. Now, it is smart to strategize with them, because sometimes they'll say, I'm applying for this particular program, and here's some issues that they seem to be very concerned about. And so then in my recommendation, I can honestly say, I understand that your program highly values programming skills and the ability to write reproducible code. Here's an example of where this person did that. And so that you're speaking to the things that matter, but you're actually doing your own work. And so I think this is also part of the integrity aspect. We all write a lot of, if we're people in my position, we write a lot of recommendations. It's very easy to become lazy and to not do our part. Letters of intent. If you're writing a grant, very often you have to write a letter of intent. Like a 2 or 3 page summary of a project. And there's some things that are striking about that. And I must say, we're working on a letter of intent right now where I think I may get a B+ on some of the things that I'm talking about. One thing that is really important is very, very often, so let's say there's a grant application about the opioid epidemic. The funding organization, they already know that the opioid epidemic is important. If you start by saying, I just want to go into a huge amount of detail about how the opioid epidemic is killing 90,000 Americans per year. It's okay to have a sentence that says that, but they already know that. What they don't know is what are you contributing that's going to help reduce that 90,000 number. So what you want to say is, as early as you can, we have an opportunity to get a unique insight. So here we had a program that had a staggered rollout across zip codes. And that really gives us a unique opportunity to evaluate the impact of mobile EMS units for post-overdose linkages to addiction care. So, this first one, the funder looks at that and they say, oh, there's actually some real here that I'm going to learn something. If you look at this bottom one, opioid overdose is a massive epidemic. No information with that first sentence. We propose to study the impact of mobile EMS. That second sentence is okay, but it doesn't get to the uniqueness of you in the same way that that top one did. So you really want to get to what is it that why are we positioned to do something important, and then give concrete examples of that, and also the concrete examples of the specific game that your team has that you're bringing to the project. And one thing we're talking about now in the grant is well-justified budget. That we can put that aside for another presentation. Some general points. Some of this is very, very repetitious, but it's important. Really being self-aware to be honest with your audience. And particularly when we're talking about things that are about policies that we're very passionate about, it is very easy to convince yourself to be less than fully transparent with your audience. And you really have to be careful about that. When you're trying to exploit a gap in information or expertise between you and your audience, that's a red flag. Obviously, if there's a gap in expertise with your audience, you have to use the tools I've been talking about earlier in this to clearly communicate. But if you realize, I would really say something different if I was talking to peer experts. That can be a red flag. There's that study limitation that you kind of downplay, but it's a real thing and it's kind of important. There's the coefficient that's statistically significant because we have a large sample, but with the effect size is effectively 0. Or I did a whole bunch of different computer runs, and I got muddy results that I never showed, but that sixth one, then I got some good stuff. So you really have to be careful about the temptations that we have to depart from integrity. And we're not propagandists, and if we get uncongenial findings, that is you have to honestly communicate that. And I remember one of my very first peer-reviewed papers, I did an analysis of syringe exchange and showed that I used all the math models that people did that showed that syringes exchange would really reduce HIV, and I applied it to hepatitis C. And I found it just didn't reduce the prevalence of hepatitis C very much. And when I went to present it, there were a bunch of people saying, this is not useful, by which they meant it was not politically moving. It would not be politically helpful to report that result. And you really have to be careful about that, because because the result was what the result was. And in fact, syringe exchange did not reduce hepatitis C, and it doesn't currently reduce overdose very much. And people have to know they can trust you for the stuff that's under the hood that either that you're not talking about today or that's beyond their particular expertise. And I think particularly when we're in situations of political polarization, we really are tempted to depart from integrity. And that doesn't mean that you're an open book on everything. There may be a study subject with a human subjects issue that you have to be confidential about. But being discreet about something where there's a real reason to do it is different from manipulating your audience. Now, one of the things that's really striking, by the way, is among the people who do not manipulate their audience in that way are good advocates and lobbyists. What's really striking is, as I mentioned, if you want to know what Greenpeace has to say about a particular piece of legislation, you can ask the Exxon lobbyist, and she'll tell you pretty directly what their argument will be. And she knows that she's in a long-term relationship with you and that you do not want to find out 2 weeks later that you've been played, because then you'll never talk to that person again in the same way. And as I mentioned, I co-chaired the Obama campaign's public health group, and then I co-chaired the Biden campaign's behavioral health advisory group in 2020. And reporters would, in 2008, reporters would call me, and this is in the primaries where Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were going at it. And they would ask me, like, what's this argument about the individual mandate? And I would say, well, the Clinton people point out that without the individual mandate, that what you could have is people that are young people who are basically healthy are not going to sign up for insurance, and the people who do sign up for insurance are more likely to be sick, sometimes for reasons that the insurer can figure out in advance and sometimes not. And so the individual mandate is a way that we try to create universal coverage that's affordable for everybody, so that the young and healthy people actually have to contribute. And then when those same young and healthy people are not healthy at some point, they can benefit from this. Now, we think in the Obama campaign, we understand these arguments, but we think as a matter of politics that we just can't pass the moves towards universal coverage that we need to if it has the mandate. So we have a different approach to that problem. And here's what we think about it. And I would talk to the reporter in a way that they knew that they never had to go and say, well, Harold characterized the Clintons' position, but I better call the Clinton people and see if they say anything different. I'm sure people did that, but I never wanted to be in a position where if they did that, they would have said, well, Harold was really playing me, because that person's not going to call me back in the same way. You're in a long-term relationship with everybody in this business. And that doesn't mean that you don't express your own point of view in a very pointed way, but you always do it in a very open and honest way. You can say, from my perspective, I think X is way more important than Y. So we think this policy is great, even though it's great on X, it's not so great on Y, but X is just so much more important than Y. That's why we do that. And there's a difference between being neutral and being transparent. And being transparent is really important, even when sometimes it's basically saying, hey, here's my position. Here, I have a very strong policy position, and here's what it is. And here's why I hold that position. And even from a totally selfish strategic point of view, I found that was incredibly valuable. Because people actually trusted what I had to say when I took that perspective. Now, grant and reviewer responses. How do I respond to reviewers? I must say, this is so difficult for me, because I always, the review, especially when reviewers are obnoxious, you just like, responding to astute critiques, a lot of reviewers can be just absolutely your best friends when they improve your papers and they catch your errors. And like any grant that we do, we really want to give it to people who can kind of team B it before we send it in. And I mentioned some of my U of C colleagues who do that for me, so that they can identify the problems in what I'm doing. And when they identify the problems, sometimes you fix them. Say I'm writing a letter of intent and somebody points out a problem. Sometimes you have to just note them as a limitation and say, here's an issue in our analysis that we understand is there. We can't fully deal with it, but here's why our analysis is still valuable. Now, the other thing is, if I send something into a journal and I get back referee comments, that's also a challenge. And I must say, very often you get low quality reviewer comments, and it's very frustrating. And there's a couple of things about that. One is, if a reviewer completely misinterprets something you wrote in a paper, and they just write something that seems really stupid, one of two things is often the case. One is that we did a really bad job of communicating something that we did in the paper, and their what appears to be a really stupid response is that they misunderstood what I was trying to say in the paper, and they were responding to that. And then the way you fix that is you fix the part of the paper that's not clearly communicated, and your response to the reviewer is, our paper was written in a way where one might have interpreted us to be saying X. And the reviewer quite correctly notes that X is not, is not tenable. Here, you will notice that we have revised the paper to more clearly indicate, here's what we're trying to say. And we appreciate that the reviewer caught this so that we could fix it and communicate our analytic approach more clearly. Also, if somebody says something that seems really, really, really stupid, you have to be careful that you are not the person who's misinterpreting something. And very, very often they're trying to communicate something to you, and if you're like, wow, this is the stupidest reviewer comment I've ever seen, sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's like, oh, I just didn't get where they were coming from. Now, the other problem is, how do I interpret the hostile reviewer? And there's no question that sometimes people can be really unprofessional and disgusting. Now, you don't have to be obsequious when people respond like that, but you do want to be transactional because this is a business. There's no point in getting into a pissing contest with a reviewer. And most of us, when our sense of self is put at risk, that's often when we become defensive, or whatever vulnerabilities we have about our own ego can come in. So, this reviewer is disrespectful, and I really want to come back with, full barrel on that. Very often, the way you want to come back is to rebut the things that the reviewer says that are incorrect, but it's a business, and that's a really important thing there. And so you have to be self-aware about your own insecurities, vulnerabilities, sources of pain, and reading when people give unkind assessments of your work. And also, by the way, when I look at this bullet, I try to remember that when I'm a reviewer, and I try to be humane. In every manuscript that I review, I try very hard not to be that reviewer. I hope that I do that. One of the things I loved about the University of Michigan when I taught there was someone could be giving a talk, and there's an obvious problem with the talk, and which 10 people in the room immediately pick up. And then the norms were such that people would say, you got a really great idea in your paper here. I think there's an issue. As you're trying to sort of tease it out, there seems to be an issue here. Let's talk about how we can solve that together. And it becomes a joint problem solving thing where you're helping the person. Now, that's not to say that you ignore a clear mistake, especially if someone say writing a paper about this is going to help us address the opioid epidemic and is wrong. You have to address that, because if something's not going to work and it's about an important public health or social thing, you have to be direct that, no, this, you've claimed that this isn't going to work. It's not going to work, but there's a human being there, and you always want to be conscious of that. If you're a reviewer, some things to keep in mind. So, you can see that I say always be respectful and humane, even if you gave a low rating to the paper or the project. Almost every paper that I review, even a paper that I recommend, has to be rejected. There's something in there that is of real value that you can note, and say, hey, this is, I learned something here, and I appreciate what the author was trying to do. That's totally consistent with saying there is a problem with this paper that they claim that they're making a causal claim here that unfortunately their study design does not support. And there's no contradiction there, that you're talking to another human honestly. Now, you do also have to be self-aware. if there's an area where your own expertise is limited, you want to be open about that. Uh, and of course, in terms of ethics, you really want to make sure when you're reviewing something that you have the required expertise to do it properly, and also that your own ego, biases, and conflict of interest are clearly there. If there's a policy that you're super invested in, you're not the best reviewer necessarily, or you at least have to be very judicious if you're reviewing a paper that criticizes that policy, that you're not that piece of that little voice in your head is not saying this paper isn't useful, because that's not your job. You can say, I disagree with this paper's assessment about X, but you have to be careful that you're not interacting strategically with the journal and with the author because of your policy preferences. And when you're a reviewer, you always want to make sure you can identify a specific contribution. If there is a real problem, really try to find ways to improve the thing. And if you don't understand something as a reviewer, it's perfectly okay to ask a clarifying question. Very often I'll say, here's a part of the paper that seems important. I'm just not sure that I understand it as a reviewer. Could you please explain why it is, that this particular variable is important, or the strategy that you use in your analysis? Can you just explain it a little more clearly? I didn't quite understand it. And if something in the paper just seems incredibly stupid, that's sometimes a cue that you're just not understanding what they're doing. So you have to be self-aware about that. Okay. When you're responding to reviewers, you want to give detailed numbered responses to all reviewer comments. So here's an example. Here's a reviewer comment that we got, and here's our response, where this point is well taken. You show that you understood what the objection was, and then you say in part to, and then you say, to try to deal with the problem that the reviewer mentioned, here's some things that we're doing, and here's our response to their critique. That is as responsive as you can make it. Sometimes I must say this was a critique that we had a response, but not a full response to everything that person would have wanted. Excuse me. But always numbered responses that show you understand what the person's saying, and here's how we respond to it, and here's how our paper now has been modified. If it's a paper, here's how our paper's been modified to respond to it. If you're writing empirical work, you want to give people a sense of the size of the effects that you're observing, not just their statistical significance. I must say, I've been on a crusade for years that people who use logistic regression often talk about odds ratios. I'm convinced that those are bad, and I'm very happy that one of the journals that I am on the editorial board for has now banned them. But I'll show you an example in a bit. And a clear table or a graph is just worth its weight in gold, where the result speaks for itself. So here's a consort diagram. This is from something we did called the Supportive Release Center, where the consort diagram just describes, here's the flow of people through your study. There were 13,000 people who were eligible, 7,000 were excluded, 6,700 were eligible to be randomized. 80 people couldn't be randomized. But of the remainder, here's how many were sent to the treatment group, here's how many were sent to the control group, here's how many went to the SRC, here's how many didn't go to the SRC when they were offered the chance to go. You look at a consort diagram and you're like, wow, I understand the flow of people from recruitment all the way through to the end. And so that's a really nice way to present any kind of a study where you're enrolling people and moving them through. Here's a graph that's kind of nice, where this is actually, we showed that we could reduce rearrests in men over age 45. So this is what's called the hazard ratio. How likely, what's the risk at any given moment in time that somebody's going to be arrested? What's their hazard rate of being arrested? And we showed that at about 1 month, there was about a third less likely to be arrested. You know, if I followed somebody for 2 hours today and they went through the SRC recently, they're a third less likely to be arrested than somebody I follow for the same 2 hours who didn't go through the SRC. That's what the hazard rate is. Here's one I love about randomized trials is here's something that you can show to anybody. So this is something that we did called Working on Womanhood. It was a randomized trial that we did. This is the average raw score in people's PTSD symptoms. And so at baseline, because we randomized, basically people had the treatment group and the control group had very similar rates of PTSD. There's slight difference just from random variability. And then we measured it again at follow-up, and here's the treatment group. You know, they're way lower than the control group. These little barbell-looking things, these are the 95% confidence intervals. And so you can see that the treatment group is lower than the control group, and it's statistically significant because these bars aren't crossing each other. So it's really nice when you can have a graph like that. Another thing that we do when we do statistical analyses, we want to show people the size of a coefficient. So this was a study that we did where we were looking at how people's views of various ways we could help people with opioid use disorders, how they differed by people's partisan affiliation. This COBRA scale is a measure of implicit racism. It's sort of a colorblind, so your sense that American society is colorblind. And then and people's views of stigmatizing attitudes towards people who lived with opioid use disorders. And we did this very complicated regression. And then what we did is we computed the predicted probability that, say, someone would support expanded government services to help people with opioid use disorders, or expanded Medicaid to help people pay for opioid use disorder treatment if they couldn't afford it, Narcan distribution to prevent overdose, and just do people believe mandatory treatment is effective? What's interesting, by the way, is this mandatory treatment variable, it turned out our respondents did not interpret it at all the way we expected. Basically, our progressive study subjects interpreted mandatory treatment as an alternative to locking somebody up. So you had somebody who's shoplifting because they had a bad drug problem. Our progressive respondents said, you know, that person should be in mandatory treatment. Don't send that guy to jail, but make him go to opioid use disorder treatment because he's stealing stuff to support his drug habit. And it was interesting that, like, here we have strong Republican to strong Democrat. And what we found was the strong Democrats are much more likely to support government services for opioid use disorder, to support expanded Medicaid services, and also to support giving Narcan out to prevent overdose. And also, weirdly enough, the Democrats were more likely to support mandatory treatment because they sort of saw it in that way as an alternative to locking people up. We also saw one of the more disturbing findings was that a big connection with people's implicit racism. The people that scored high on an implicit racism scale were much less supportive of everything that you'd want to do to help people with opioid use disorders. There's sort of a popular narrative that the opioid epidemic is deracialized, which it is compared to the crack epidemic from 30 years ago, but it's still quite racialized. And then also we looked at people having stigmatized attitudes towards opioid use disorder, and people that expressed the most stigma were also the most reluctant to support sort of public health interventions to help people with opioid use disorders. And what I like about these, what are called margin plots, is you can see right away, wow, you know, this person's much likely, you can see how the people that are the people with really low stigma scores, you know, are 80% supportive of expanding government OUD services. The people with really high stigma scores, they're only 40% supportive. Wow, that's a big difference. And you can show this graph to anybody, and you don't have to have some sort of a number in a weird statistical table that people aren't going to understand. And there's a lot of people, if you say I'm putting up a regression, people are like, what's a regression? And and so here you can say, we predicted based on, we kept everything the same except for their political party, and we looked at how did their views change of Medicaid if I moved that person from a strong Republican to a strong Democrat. Wow, look at how much more supportive they are of Medicaid there. That is an excellent PowerPoint slide. So anyway, I'll stop here, and I'm glad we had a nice discussion, and I really I enjoyed our conversation today. And I'm sorry that I just did a bad job of getting through all my slides. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and let's see if I can stop the recording.